Tutawa mai runga, tutawa mai raro, tutawa mai roto, tutawa mai waho. Kia tau ai te Maori tū, te Maori ora ki te katoa, homie huie taiki e. Tēnā koutou, no mai haere mai ki tēnei hui. Welcome to this meeting and this gathering today. Most of you know me. My name is Muriel Morgan. I'm the coordinator for Volunteering Mid and South Canterbury based in Ashburton, and Sarah is the co-host. Sarah is the coordinator for Mid Canterbury Citizens Advice Bureau. And we have a mixture of people from both organisations here today. After Warren's given his presentation, there are snacks later on. We've got sandwiches and sushi, and there'll be hot drinks over on a trolley over here. So do stay behind to enjoy a little light lunch before you go, and mix with the people here and get to know the new ones that you haven't met before. Warren is well known in Ashburton for his work as an advocate on behalf of so many different people in town. And I used to be working in the budget service, and we in the budget service loved when Warren came on board and started his role here. It was a big help for us and for the people of Ashburton. So he's well known for his negotiation skills, and so he's given this presentation for us last year, and he's going to do it again this year. So welcome, Warren.
Thank you, Mira. Well, morning. Kia ora. I think everybody in the room knows me, but if there's anybody watching who doesn't, I have a graduate diploma in conflict management, which is a strange qualification to have, and I'm a member of AMINS, which is the Arbitrators and Mediators Institute of New Zealand. And I have a passion about negotiation, mediation, and working through difficult conversations. So I've spent the last 5 years doing exactly that in my role as a community advocate. Every day was just moving from one difficult conversation to the next. So my colleague who's taken over from you is smiling over there. So, okay, not working. Don't panic. Cool. Oh, sorry, pressing the wrong button. Pilot error. All right, so just a quick rundown of the topics we're going to talk about today. So negotiation is a journey. We're not taught to how to navigate. We're not taught to negotiate. We learn it as we grow up. We sort of learn it. We might learn it from our work, but nobody sits down and actually discusses it as a theoretical topic or teaches us how to do it. I'm going to talk briefly about mediation. I'm passionate about mediation, so I'll give a little presentation on that, and just talk about the fact that it's a process. There is a process to mediation if it's done right, and if you work through that process, you'll have success. Emotion is the silent negotiator in conflict. Emotions will always have a play in anything that we're doing around negotiations and difficult conversations. The trick is to be aware of them, know that they're there, and not be scared of them. And difficult conversations are going to happen no matter how we try to insulate ourselves. So be prepared. Curiosity is the best tool when starting difficult conversations, and we'll talk about some tools how to manage a difficult conversation. Right, negotiation is a journey we're not taught to navigate. Like it or not, you are a negotiator. Every day we have conversations that are really negotiations. Where shall we go for lunch? What do you kids want for tea? Can I have a raise? They're all negotiations. We're always negotiating. They're all forms of negotiation. So negotiations such as workplace or relationship negotiations often require an alternative approach. Our normal model that we learn is a distributive negotiation, which is usually a transactional model. So I'm referring here to the sort of negotiation you're probably used to, say buying a car. It's a simple transactional model really, where you as the buyer trying to get the lowest price and the seller's trying to get the highest price, and you all know that you're going to end up somewhere in the middle. Today I'd like to introduce the alternative, which is labelled integrative model. This model usually requires more time to work, and it's not a zero sum and can produce transformational results. So what I was taught was, when you're doing the transactional model, we're talking about, if you imagine a pie, we're dividing up the pie. An integrative model is recognizing the fact that the pie is not a fixed size. We can decide what the pie is, and by being creative, we can create alternatives and situations where we can get results without actually having a loss for one party and a win for the other party. So it's the classic win-win model. It's best captured in this little book, which is called Getting to Yes by Fisher and Urey. Anybody who's interested in negotiating or just working through difficult conversations, I recommend buying this book. It's small, it's cheap. It was written in the 80s, and it's still the Bible for negotiators. If you ever wonder how people who are working through things like trying to negotiate a solution in Gaza or Ukraine actually get results, they start with this book. So negotiation can be defined as a process by which two parties with differences that they need to resolve try to reach agreement. Now that's a formal definition, and there's some core elements to it that we need to register if we want to be good at negotiation. First of all, negotiation is a process. The parties do have differences. If the parties don't have differences, you won't be negotiating. And the parties need to resolve the differences. And this is the clue. If you're going into a negotiation, you've got to actually figure out a way that the other party needs to resolve that difference if you're going to have any success. So negotiation will take place in stages, and to be good at it we need to recognise each stage and be comfortable knowing what to expect will happen in each stage. This allows us to effectively influence each stage. So the three stages of a good negotiation are analysis, planning and discussion. And by the way, if anybody has any questions, please feel free to stop and ask. So during the analysis stage, you're simply trying to diagnose the situation, to gather information, organise it and think about it. And this is an important point that I've found in all the work that I did. Every meeting I held, every negotiation I went into, the secret was I was there to gather information. Every conversation you had, you can gather information. And if you think it like that, when you go into those difficult conversations, it might be you guys talking to Orangatamariki, or you've got to take somebody in a system in MSD or something like that. You're there to gather information, and if you think like that, it can overcome some of the fears and concerns that you have in dealing with the other person. Now during the planning stage, you're generating ideas and deciding what can be done. Both these stages of a negotiation can take place either when you're with the other party or separately. You can do a lot of this work before you go into a negotiation. What I use is I like mind mapping. So I will write up or draw up little boxes on my piece of paper, and I'll write down, maybe I'll start with the problem, and then you'll start working off different directions with different ideas or different situations that you're dealing with. Now, during the discussion stage, when the parties communicate back and forth looking to an agreement, differences can be acknowledged and addressed. Okay, so the discussion stage is when you sit down with the other party and you actually start nutting out the problems and looking for solutions. So Fisher and Urey use 4 basic principles to create a process that defines a straightforward method of negotiation. So these principles are: people, separate the people from the problem. I'll highlight each of these later on in the presentation. Interests, focus on interests, not positions. And we'll talk about the difference between the two. When we get to options, invent multiple options looking for mutual gains before deciding on what to do. All right? This is brainstorming. You should actually sit down and come up with lots of different ideas to solve a problem rather than just getting fixated on one thing. And when you finally get to a result, insist that the results be based on some objective criteria. So that means when you're drawing up an agreement or finishing up a negotiation, try and base it on a criteria that has an outside basis. We'll talk about that shortly. So, separate the people from the problem. If we focus on the people in the negotiation, we'll tend to be either hard on the people with possible negative consequences. This is where we'll call them names, or we'll tell them they're wrong, blame them. Or we'll be soft on them, which may not achieve the result we want. Separating the people from the problem allows us to be hard on the problem without damaging the relationship. So look for what your problem is and talk about that, rather than the personality of the person you're dealing with or what they've done wrong. This requires carefully identifying and agreeing on the problem. So for me, the first part of any negotiation is actually sit down and ask, what are we negotiating about? Actually talk about what the problems are, what the differences are, rather than start talking about all sorts of different things, which can often lead to talking about people. This also allows the parties to see themselves as working side by side and attacking the problem rather than each other. And this is what I base my work on. If we can work on the principle, if we're facing an issue of people working side by side rather than working opposite each other, you're more likely to get a solution. I will physically do that. Rather than sit opposite somebody on a table, if I can arrange it that we sit side by side, I will physically do it. It makes a difference. If you put down a document in front of you and start talking about that, and you're side by side, you will physically get a different result. And a little note there, people problems tend to be perceptions, emotions, and communication. So people come up with the wrong perceptions of what's going on, they make assumptions, emotions get involved, or we simply have communication errors. We're talking about two different things. So, interests. Focus on interests, not positions. When we're negotiating, we adopt a position on the difference being discussed. So positions are visible and they become anchors, and they often start defining the negotiations. The interesting thing about positions, and I'm talking here about you decide what your position is, you decide what you think the solution will be. So if we take the extremes, we talk about conspiracy theorists, they adopt a position on a subject. The interesting thing about positions is the first thing we do when we adopt a position is we start investing in that position. And by investing in it, I mean we start trying to justify it. And we all do this. We will do it automatically. We'll do it instinctively. We won't even recognize that we're doing it. But we will start finding reasons that that position's the right one. We will start looking for people who agree with us. And before long, we've created a little bubble that says we're right and the other side's wrong. So, unless you identify, so interests are the drivers of the positions, the motivation for adopting a position. So that's the reason why we've adopted that position. An interest often is economic. You know, we had adopt a position that I should get a raise. The interest is I need the extra money. The motivation is I need the recognition of that extra raise. So those are the differences I'm talking about. So unless you identify the interests at play, both your counterparts and your own, it will be hard to move parties from their positions and hard to build a sustainable solution or agreement. So if two people have different positions, you're trying to move them from those positions. And unless you identify and talk about their interests, the reasons that they're adopting those positions, you won't make any progress.
Can you, if I'm with a conspiracy theorist,
Yes.
how do you identify their interests and bring them onto that level?
You've got to, it's once again, it's that gathering that information, Muriel. But you've got to identify, well, okay, what's in it for them? You know, with the conspiracy theorists, what's in it for them? It might be the recognition that they're getting. It might be the sense of belonging to something. And if you start to talk about that and work on that, you might be able to nudge them away to a different position. Does that help? Yeah. Okay, when we start talking about options, we should invent multiple options looking for mutual gains before deciding on what to do. This is the problem-solving part of any negotiation, and if it's done properly, it will mean nothing is left on the table when an agreement is reached. And by creating multiple possible solutions, both individually and as partners, parties can discover solutions that advance shared interests. You're looking for options that will produce mutual gain. And this is the win-win situation that we're talking about. This is the bit that people often don't do. I've had lots of people who come to me and told me they're really good negotiators. And I say, well, why are you really a good negotiator? Because I always win. Right. You don't know when you do that what you've left on the table. You don't know what you've missed out on if you haven't discussed all the different options. To give you a very simple example, if you're purchasing that car and you're trying to buy it from Christchurch, you may reach a point where you're only a few $100s difference in price, but you can't agree. But there might be an option there where the dealer up in Christchurch will deliver that car to Ashburton for free because he's coming down here anyway. That's worth several $100s to you by the time you've driven up there, picked up the car and brought it back here. So you can have a mutual gain. You can come out purchasing the price at the dealer wants, but you've got a deal that actually financially you're the same. It's a balance. It's a very simple example, but that's what I'm talking about. So when it comes to criteria, insist that the results be based on some objective standard. And this is where you start I'm talking about sort of more high level negotiations here, but once you get to the stage where you're going to reach a solution, one of the biggest problems is buyer's remorse. One of the biggest problems is people have a negotiation, you think you've got everything solved, you walk out of the room and you find that everybody, you know, a day later they come back and they don't like it. The secret to working through that is to use objective criteria. Those criteria could be market values, if we're talking about purchasing something. Expert opinion. So we could say, okay, well, we're going to make this agreement, but it's going to be based on what an expert says. Verified statistics, custom or law. If you can agree what the fair objective standard will be, it removes the requirement for one party to give in to the other and both can defer to the criteria. It sounds complicated. I don't know if I've made sense of it to you, but if you think about it, you can work your way through it. If we have an outside criteria for setting our agreement, then nobody's going to feel that the other party is imposing something on them. A classic one is if there's a construction dispute, well, you might decide that an expert's going to decide, you know, what the solution will be. If a disagreement's over the cost of a repair or something like that. You can get an expert to provide an answer, or you can have a standard market value that you work towards. So, principled negotiation, sometimes known as the integrative bargaining, is a collaborative model of negotiation as opposed to the standard we are used to, which is adversarial or competitive negotiation or bargaining. To mediate or undertake a difficult conversation, a collaborative model is more likely to achieve a sustainable solution. So, to be successful at an integrative negotiation, you need to understand what a BATNA is. So a BATNA is your best alternative to a negotiated agreement. This is your plan B, and it's often the standard against you'll measure any settlement that you progress to. So a BATNA is not your bottom line. A BATNA is you sit down before you start and you think, what is the best alternative if I don't do this? What is the best alternative if I don't agree? What's going to happen? So, you know, if we go back to our situation with a raise, well, what's the best alternative if I don't get a raise? You know, what am I going to accept? It might be that I'll find another job. It might be I just suck it up and get on with life. But you have that in your head as you're going into the negotiation. It's a bit like I learned as a youngster. My parents loved going to the races. I had a simple principle that if I went, I'd have $10. Once that was gone, that was the end of the day. I didn't go on gambling. If you don't have a BATNA, you'll go on gambling. You'll go on working through and letting the other side push you further and further. Now, the reason you negotiate is to produce something better than the result you can obtain without negotiating. If you've not thought out what will happen if you don't reach a negotiated settlement, you are operating blind. Without a BATNA, you will be committed to reaching agreement. You always have an option of saying no and walking away, and try to consider what the other side's BATNA is or will be, because if you can work that out, you can have some control on the situation. With negotiations, the thing that always fascinated me was the power dynamic when you go into a negotiation. If you go into a negotiation, there's always an imbalance, or nearly always an imbalance of power. And it can be quite daunting, threatening. Some people feel, you know, that they haven't got a show. Why waste their time? I believe you always have some power in a negotiation. You always have some control over the situation. You always have some levers that you can pull. One lever is you can always walk away. And that often works. Sometimes when you work away and the other side realises that that's your point of no, they will actually change their minds. So now we're just going to talk briefly about mediation. Mediation is a process, not an event. It involves a step-by-step procedure that is first unravels the conflict and then moves the parties towards generating options for solution. Just has anybody here been in a mediation, a formal mediation? Yep. How did you find the process, Jeff?
It was daunting. It was my first and still only experience, but it got results. The way that it was a negotiation around custody and yeah, it was the right way to do it. We, on our own, we weren't going to make a difference. We had someone in between who was able to facilitate the pros and cons, and yeah, so mediation is the way to go. Yeah.
So what I wanted to stress today is if it's done right, it is a process. As Jeff said, it's very daunting, especially if you're the first time you get involved in it. I've been involved in multiple mediations. I've either ran myself or have assisted people through them, both FDR mediations, which is family dispute resolution, or employment mediations. Each mediator does it a little bit different, but there is a process there. So the process is centered on the parties, not the mediator. And this is why it's called a consensual dispute resolution process. One, you consent to doing it. If both parties don't consent, you can't be forced into a mediation, whereas you can be forced to go to court. So I'll stress this. The mediator is not a decision maker. It is a consensual process and the parties decide the outcome. That's the secret to it. That's what makes it a successful process. So the basics are: the mediator is an impartial facilitator. If they do their job right, they will establish the ground rules that allow the problem-solving conversation to take place. So the mediator decides where and when it takes place. The mediator decides who can attend. The mediator will decide things on how the conversation will take place. The mediator will establish who the parties are and their relationship to each other. The mediator will define the dispute as it has been presented to them. So they will actually lay out, this is what we're here for. The process then continues with both parties being allowed to present their case regarding the dispute, and this is done without interruption. We'll talk about interruptions later, but that's a really important factor. And at the completion of these presentations, the mediator summarizes the outlines and then the parties can respond to each other. If it's done right, each party should have a chance to talk freely without the other person interfering, responding. That way the mediator gets to hear both cases in a free and fair way. The object of this part of the process is to identify the issues and the differences. This allows the acknowledgement of parties' positions and emotions. So we're going back to what we talked about before. And when differentiation is established and differences are recognised, the next phase can be exploring the issues and interests. So if you ever get involved in trying to mediate something, you need to realise that you have to work through this stage before you start the problem solving. We all love problem solving. We all want to jump into that phase of the process. If we don't have the conversations about the differences, and I'll stress these are the emotional conversations, they're the difficult conversations, they're the ones nobody wants to have. They can often involve lots of crying and screaming. If you don't go through that bit, you won't solve your problems. And that applies to the advocacy work that I did and the difficult conversations that I've had. You've got to go through that stage. So the issues of the problems the parties have, the interests of the motivations the parties have driving the positions the parties have adopted about the issues. The problem-solving phase involves recognition of common interests and common ground. So the mediator will look for common interests. They'll look for common grounds in relation to the problem. And this is done by creating multiple options which can be then assessed for merit. So it's putting everything on the table. It's one of those things where people should sit down and put every idea down, and nobody should say it's a silly idea, because you don't know what the conversation is going to lead to. So no option should be ignored or ridiculed. If you do that bit right, you'll get an outcome, you'll get an agreement. The final phase is the outcome, and it's a form of agreement is achieved if a form of agreement is achieved, the goal of mediation is to create commitment that it will make the agreement sustainable. And agreements should be detailed as to implementation. I've found the big secret is get that commitment from people. Get them to sign something. And this applies to any of the negotiation or work that you're doing, even with the CAB interviews and that sort of thing. If you can get people to commit to doing something, they're more likely to do it. That can just be a promise, it can be a verbal promise, it can be a written agreement. And if you are doing a mediated agreement, it should be as detailed as possible. So if we were looking at an employment agreement where the solution was the employer is going to pay the employee, well, we didn't just say that. We said how much, we said when, we said how it's going to be paid, which bank account it's going to be paid, and then we talked about what was going to happen if it wasn't paid. That's the sort of detail I'm talking about. So the secret to both negotiation and mediation, the secret to successful participation is to be aware. Be aware of your own positions and biases, the other party's positions and interests and biases, and be aware of what is going on here. What phase are we in? Why are they reacting that way? Why am I responding as I am? This is what I call reflecting in a problem or a situation, and we'll talk about that later. So, have I given you a bit of an outline of how a mediation process works? And very briefly, I'd like to ask you, what problems can you see for managers, because some of you might be managers of volunteers, who try to mediate disputes. So if you have a dispute between two volunteers, what problems can you see as a manager if you try and do that? Putting them together in the same room. You're not impartial, exactly. That's the biggest problem. You have an interest in the game for a start. And to be honest, you know, taking that sort of role on, I'm actually seeing it quite a lot out in the, I was, out in the workforce at the moment. There's a lot of employee on employee disputes going on. Managers get involved, they think they're going to mediate it. One, they're not impartial. Two, they're in a lose-lose situation because one of the parties is going to be upset with whatever outcome they've got if they don't do it right. So as a manager, you're just going to lose out. You are better trying to bring in people who are independent. That's a nice picture. And managing emotions within a negotiation or a difficult conversation. Emotions disrupt reasoning. Emotion is the silent negotiator in conflict. So if we accept the simple rationale that emotions disrupt reasoning, it can be seen emotions are going to have significant and often negative influence in conflict disputes and virtually any negotiation. So for those actively involved in a negotiation, a dispute or a difficult conversation, awareness of our own emotional state, the emotions at play for other parties to the dispute, and the influence those emotions will have on reason is a powerful tool for resolving differences. So negative emotions can be defined as abundance of deficit. Something's missing. Abundance of deficit can be a perception of an unbalanced allocation of resources. Somebody's getting something I'm not. So that's, you know, one of the deficits you'll see. A deficit of credit or acknowledgement. Somebody feels they're not being credited with something or acknowledged for something they've done. And a deficit of security or a deficit of belonging. A deficit of security is your economic issues or your own safety. And a deficit of belonging is you feeling you don't belong to the group that you're in. These are all powerful drivers of emotions. So there's a basic set of core emotional concerns or needs. They are autonomy. We all like to think we have some control over our own lives. We all like to think we have some say in what's happening. If we lose that autonomy, emotions will come to the fore. Appreciation. We want to be appreciated for what we do. As a manager, one of your most powerful tools is to show appreciation. Affiliation. We all have a very strong desire to belong. Role or purpose in life. Our role in life is really significant to our identity. The first thing that happens when you're introduced is, what's your name? What do you do? Your role in life is a big part of your identity. And our status, how we feel we are perceived by others. This is our integrity. If you want to explore why people, when we were talking about how we establish what people's interests are, you go back to these subjects here and you'll find one or more of those will be in play. A deficit of any emotional need creates a sense of fear. So, this is my view, the primary basic emotional driver for conflict is fear. Fear behaviour is essential for survival, includes fleeing, freezing, or to remain inconspicuous, withdrawing from a situation, or fighting. Okay. Now I want to stress this a little bit because we've all talked about fight or flight. And I'm sure we all have a good understanding of what fight or flight means. But what we don't appreciate is that there's a couple of other spaces people can go to, and they are freezing, to remain inconspicuous, or withdrawing from the situation. It's the possum in the headlights type thing. And if you're working with people, if you're in a difficult conversation or a conflicting situation, you want to learn to watch for this, because you will see people shut themselves down. You will see people in a difficult conversation or in a difficult meeting just go, you can actually see the eyes glaze over, and people will shut themselves down. And if somebody does that, it doesn't matter what you say or do, you're not going to change anything. Believe it or not, I learned this from training horses. They're far more obvious about it, and once we saw that in a horse, we knew that we were wasting our time. We had to do something different. So watch for that as you're working through things.
How do you draw that person out of that situation?
That's a very
Just leave it and do it another time?
That's an excellent question, and you have to. I mean, you learn that skill from experience. Sometimes you can just change the subject for a little bit, talk about something different. You might try focusing on the, instead of what might have triggered it is we're talking about positions, so we can try starting to focus on interests. Having a break, time for a cup of tea. Will give people a chance to think. You're giving people space to think. But yeah, it's a real challenge, and sometimes you just have to stop. You have to say, no, we'll come back tomorrow. Okay, so fear behaviour is essential for survival. The internal response to the emotion of fear by individuals is to engage in defensive and protective behaviour that promotes survival. When people get scared, the first thing they will do is they'll get defensive. And you will see that in your other parties. They'll get angry, they'll get red in the face. They'll get abusive, all those sorts of things. Just recognise that there's a fear behind that. The interest that's driving it is a fear. What I would try and do if I'm reflecting properly in that conversation is I'll be trying to figure out, well, what is that fear? And how can I address it? How could I say, well, maybe we can mitigate that or change it? So I would stress here the same thing can apply to institutions. Institutions get scared. Institutions will adopt the same approaches. So you might be arguing with not the person, but the organisation. So the individual has experienced a sense of deficit and they're reacting to protect themselves. The consequence of a defensive response of fear is it promotes the emotion of anger. So the next thing after you've triggered the fear will be the anger. Even when we are withdrawing or freezing in response to a fear emotion, we will be angry inside. So the person who's gone glazed, they'll still be stewing away inside. Feelings of anger are linked to thoughts of blame, and this creates a loop that intensifies the anger. So what we do is we get angry, we blame somebody else. Once we start to realise it's their fault, well, we get angrier. These are things that I'm stressing these because you've got to realise this is happening to you as well. Even if you're on the other side, even if you're the person in control. From this rationale, it must be recognised that anger is a reasonable consequence of some actions. You can't expect people not to be angry. And anger hijacks our rationality. It becomes the lens through which we see the world. Everybody here felt that at times? And anger can be the silent decision maker in a dispute. Don't make a decision when you're angry. It'll probably be the wrong one. But just realise that the other party, if you let them make a decision when they're angry, it probably won't work. It probably won't be a problem that'll solve itself. So a threat to our identity can be a driver of fear in a dispute. We see ourselves in black and white, which is an either-or perspective. So as an example, if we see ourselves as kind, for example, it is unconsciously very hard to accept a comment or implication of somebody telling us we were being unkind. And that drives a defensive position. Recognise your own identity and why you think like this, but always also recognise that if you're calling somebody out for being something, a horrible person, they probably don't see themselves that way. The way to manage the emotional response in others is to describe a problem as an impact on you rather than condemning the other party. In this way, emotion can be diffused. So talk about how things are impacting you rather than why they are the cause of the problem. In conflict, dealing with emotion starts with being aware they exist, and I'm talking about emotions there. They will play a part in the conversation in any attempt to resolve a conflict. Awareness of all emotions in play and what the impact of these emotions can be on parties allows you to negotiate, mediate, or work towards sustainable solutions. So once again, I get back to this awareness. Be aware of what's going on. You can rationalise emotions by listening, acknowledging clearly what was being said, and directly addressing the emotional dynamic of a dispute. Directly addressing the emotional dynamic can actually be done by naming the emotion. An example is, you can say something like, it's not a good idea to say you're really angry, but you can say it seems like there's a lot of anger involved here. By naming that emotion, then you can address it and talk about it. Why is that anger there? Then we start talking about interest rather than the problem. So, how's everybody going? We'll start talking about difficult conversations. Difficult conversations are going to happen no matter how we insulate ourselves. The question is what can be achieved by doing them well and by getting our own way and having these conversations. Sorry, getting out of our own way and having these conversations. A difficult conversation is anything we find hard to talk about. If we go back to that, it could be the subject matter, right? That's the problem. It could be, you know, we're talking about a difficult subject with somebody. It could be, I think one of the things that makes the conversation difficult for us is the uncertainty of the outcomes. So the first thing we do when contemplating a difficult conversation is to ask ourselves, why are we finding this conversation difficult? What is causing us that sense of unease or dread? What is making it uncomfortable? What may be causing those feelings in the other party? The answer is likely to be the conversation challenges our respective identities, and or are we uncertain of the outcome? So is that clear? Does people understand what I mean by that? If the conversation is challenging my identity, I'm going to be uncomfortable with it. If I'm uncertain of the outcome, then I'm likely to be uncomfortable with it.
Or don't agree with the outcome.
We haven't got that far yet, Jeff. We're contemplating the conversation. Yeah, that's the uncertainty. Yes, sometimes you think you can see outside, and you feel it's not going to be the one that you.
If the meeting's not going your way, because
Yep.
that sounds bad, doesn't it?
Excuse me, I find for me difficult conversations is more than someone's their emotional state.
The other party's emotional
Yeah.
state. You find that difficult. Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
Or if they've got mental health issues. And they're being aggressive, as more people being aggressive with me, I find difficult.
Yep.
Then
And that's interesting. It's worth exploring that. Because it comes back to, it does in a way come back to your identity, your insecurity, and your feelings that we talked about before of those core emotional drivers. You know, so the emotions of the other party is creating emotion in you. But it's true, yeah. And once again, it develops that uncertainty of just plain what's going to happen. I mean, one of the uncertainties I'm talking about here is we can be uncertain how the other party's going to react. So if we've got to make that phone call and we know, you know, we think the other party's going to blow up on us, well, that becomes a difficult conversation, doesn't it?
Often, like in the CAB, we're in a conversation which is not difficult for us, but it's difficult for the person that's talking to us. And so it's really important to see it from their perspective too, right?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, so a difficult conversation can be a one-sided difficulty.
Yes,
Yeah.
and I found that in the role that I had,
Yes.
both because I was experienced in it and also I wasn't necessarily invested in the problem itself. Yes, the difficult conversation can be for the other party, but that doesn't mean it, just as you said, it doesn't mean it doesn't make it difficult for you, does it? Because you're uncertain of the reaction, you're dealing with other people's emotions. So each difficult conversation is likely to be multiple conversations taking place at the same time. What we have is a what's happened or what's happening conversation. This is where we struggle with our different stories about who's right, who meant what, and most importantly, who is to blame. Okay? Then we have the feeling conversation. It's a difficult conversations are also about emotions, and ignoring those emotions will have its perils. And the identity conversation is about who we are and how we see ourselves. And importantly, will others see us as the villain? So this applies to both parties. So, you know, in the situation Mira is talking about, it's the other party who might be worried. How are you going to see this story? Are you going to be on my side or the other side? You know, and I have a bit of a favourite saying is that every villain is the hero of their own story. Every villain believes they're the good guy. I think that, despite some of the things that we see. So being aware of these different conversations taking place on both sides can help us keep a balance. So curiosity is the best tool when starting a difficult conversation. To converse well, we must first learn to listen. I've given you all a little handout about listening. I'm passionate about active listening. Listening is an active exercise rather than a passive event. To listen well when involved in a difficult conversation, we must first engage by not talking. Taking time to hear what they have to say, avoiding rehearsing our reply in our head, and acknowledging what they have said will alter the pattern of a conversation. Over the years, this is what I feel is the secret to the work I did. It was learning to listen. And I don't think I'm unique, but I found that I really had to train myself, I really had to teach myself to do this. So what I say is never underestimate the power of silence. We humans dislike silence and we see it as a space to be filled. By staying silent, we can create space for our counterpart to say something or say more, disclosing information which we need to understand their position. This is a technique used by police in interrogation, by lawyers, and I use it when I do conflict training for clients. Right? I had a person I'm working with the other day having a particularly difficult negotiation with the employer, and we did some coaching to work their way through the meeting that they were going to have. And I encouraged them to use this trick, I'll call it. So they were asked a question, and instead of launching into their immediate anger-based reply, they just sat and listened and thought about it for a little while. And I said, and they were telling me about it, and I said, well, how did that go? And they said, sure enough, he started talking and filled the space for me and gave more information. So don't underestimate the power of the silence. With the CAB stuff, the work that you're doing, I'd stress that. Sometimes it's best just to keep quiet and listen to what they say. Sometimes, if you don't say anything, there's a couple of things that will happen. They will think that you haven't heard. So they will repeat what they've said. But one of the things that happens there is they will repeat it using different words because they thought you haven't understood it. And you know what happens then? They hear a different story in their heads. When they use their own words but differently, they hear it differently, and it can change their perceptions. Active listening involves giving your counterpart your attention, giving them space to talk by not interrupting, and acknowledging what they have said by paraphrasing or summarising. So, who can tell me the difference between paraphrasing and summarising? Sorry, I'm turning this into a teacher's class. Does anybody want to give it a go?
Paraphrasing would be quoting.
So,
Summarising is just rounding up a conclusion.
So summarising is a real skill that you need as a negotiator or a mediator, and I think even in the work that you're doing in the CAB. At the end of a conversation, if you summarise, you just put together the story in your words. Okay? If I'm doing an employment negotiation, I always at the end of a meeting, summarise what's been said and what's been decided, whether I'm leading the meeting or not. The secret to that is then you have agreement about what's actually been said. Paraphrasing is when you actually copy what they've said, not necessarily using their words, but you're repeating their statements. Okay? And they both have different effects. But both of them, summarising and paraphrasing, what they tell the other party is, you've listened. You've heard what I've said. So listening skills. Give people your full attention. Hi, Jackie. I'm told not to make a fuss about you coming. Listening skills. Give people your full attention. Try to control distractions and do not think about what you want to say next. I was having a conversation with a good friend of mine who's he's been a counsellor. He's been a counsellor for, I don't know, 30 or 40 years. But we were just having a cup of coffee and having a conversation. And we were talking away, and I suddenly realised he's listening to me. As a counsellor, he does it instinctively. But because of my training, I could observe him listening to me. It makes a difference. You feel good about it. You feel the other person is actually paying attention to you, might be hearing what you're saying. So show them you're engaged. Nod and make small comments and look at the speaker. Avoid interrupting. And this is something we all do. And there's times you have to interrupt, but avoid it. This can take a lot of patience, but if you are interrupting, you cannot be listening. It is physically impossible to listen and speak at the same time. So if you interrupt somebody, you're not listening to them. Occasionally take the time to pause and to clarify their meaning. Use questioning and paraphrase what they are saying. So don't hesitate to ask clarifying questions. Did you mean this? Is that what you were trying to say? Or I'm hearing you said this, am I hearing it right? And take a note of their tone, pace, and observe body language. Beware of your own body languages, because these can influence their reactions. This is why I don't like Zoom. I think Zoom's a great tool, but it has its flaws. You cannot see the body language of the other party. And you can not use your own body language. You can use, if you're aware of your own body language, you can influence a conversation. If you lean into a conversation, it'll change the way people will hear you. If you lean out of a conversation, people will react differently. And by that, I mean physically leaning into a person or physically leaning away.
Just on that interrupting.
Yep.
But if they've, got a big spiel and there's something that they've said that you really need to make note of, but they're just going to carry on, but you need to address it right then.
Yep. So I said avoid it. I didn't say don't do it at all. I agree that there are times you have to interrupt.
Yeah.
By avoiding it, what I would sometimes do is take a note,
Yeah.
and then come back to it when they stop. But we do have some clients, or we've had some clients who just don't stop. They just keep talking, and sometimes you have to say, hang on a minute, I need a little break here. But if we're just sitting there interrupting people all the time, and I mean by interrupting too, I mean interrupting somebody in full spiel. We're forcing our opinion onto them, but we're also they will lose their train of thought. When asking follow-up questions, try to keep the questions open. This encourages deeper discussion, and use how to and what if questions to encourage further conversation. Open questions are simply questions that cannot be answered yes or no. So if it's a straight yes or no question, it's a closed question. But if you're asking a question that can be answered in multiple different ways, it's an open question. Try and use open questions when you're having these types of conversations and you're trying to elicit information from people. And the how-to question and the what-if questions are really powerful questions. So if somebody's saying, asking you, demanding that you do something, well, we say, okay, well, that's fine, but how can we do that? As soon as you do that, you've actually moved to that situation where you're beside that person, working alongside them, how can we work together to solve this? But you're not saying you're going to agree to that. You're just saying how can we do it, and we're asking them for suggestions. The what if question is always fun, because you can ask, what if we did this? What if that wasn't a problem? And that can create creative thoughts and different pathways. So if the situation is you're having a conversation and everybody keeps saying, oh, we can't afford that, we can't afford that. Try that, well, what if we could afford it? Changes the conversation. You can have a whole different conversation about a whole different lot of things. Then you find out that, well, actually we've got a solution here. It will be fun to try and fund it, and people will fund it. So where am I? When responding, do so thoughtfully, reflect on what has been said and try to understand their perspective even if you disagree with it. It is, it's very hard. But you've got to remember, if you're in these conversations, there's two parties to the conversation. And if you can't try and understand what they're saying and why they're saying it, then how are you going to convince them that you're right? And to end, summarise the conversation, recap key points and try to ensure agreement on what has been said and what has been agreed to. Stress any solutions that have been agreed. This is really important. I was in a, what they call a round table meeting with some parties to a family dispute. There were 3 lawyers present. It went too long. Everybody was tired when we finished. We didn't summarise and agree. The next day I was dealing with 3 lawyers who had 3 different impressions of what happened that day in that meeting. And these are people who are trained. So summarising it, writing it down, really important if you can do it. So reflect, ask questions, learn to use open or closed questions, learn to ask clarifying questions. Reflection involves reflecting in and reflecting on. We all reflect on a conversation, rehearsing what to say beforehand and dissecting what was said afterwards. So I'm sure we've all had these little things going on in our minds. We've got a conversation coming up, we rehearse it, we script it, we think out what we're going to say, and then afterwards we sit down and say, well, why the hell didn't I say that? Or why did I say that? Reflecting involves training ourselves to consider what is happening, what is going on while the conversation is taking place. So how many people here feel they can do that? When you're in the middle of a really difficult conversation, do you actually take a little bit of time to reflect what's going on here? Why are they saying that? Why am I saying that?
What? Observing body language.
Yep, that can be part of it. It's a really powerful tool if you can do it, and it's why that, if we get back to that, taking that little moment of silence, if you take that moment to consider, okay, he's driving me nuts, what's going on about this, but why is he doing it? What's the reason for it? Why is he getting angry? Why am I getting angry? If you can do those sorts, if you can train yourself to do those sorts of things in a conversation, you will find it will change those difficult conversations quite dramatically. So take time to pause occasionally to think, consider at what stage we are now and what interests are driving this part of the conversation. Never undervalue the power of a silence, and then ask, I'll go back to it, how can we do that? So language is an important tool to be aware of within a difficult conversation. The language we use and the way we use it will decide how others react to us. So when you're in those difficult conversations, those difficult negotiations, try to use phrases like, it feels like you're saying, it seems like this is happening, what I think I am hearing. By putting those little headers on your sentences, what you're actually doing is creating some wiggle room for the other party. You're not attacking them straight on. You can still ask some really pointed questions. You can still really get your point across. But you will avoid that defensiveness and you give people room to think and room to have their own opinions. These phrases leave the other party with room to listen because you are not directly questioning the person or making a direct accusation. Try practicing that and see if it makes a difference. So in my work, when talking about conversations that have been difficult, I would often comment that the story is not the story. There's always more to events and more to hear. So, I mean, I think we've all been through that. People ring us up, tell us this big long story, and we think, oh yeah, that's really hard. They're having a really terrible time and it's all the other person's fault. We can guarantee there's more to it than that. When we have to deal with a difficult conversation, there tends to be 3 stories that exist within that conversation. There's your story written from your perspective and containing your prejudices, judgments and bias. There's their story, your counterpart's story, written from their perspective and containing their prejudice, judgments and biases. And this gets back to the, every villain being the hero of their own story. They'll believe they're the perfect person. There is a third story, and that's of a third party neutral observing the conversation and viewing both the other side's stories at the same time. So if you start your conversation off by framing your conversation from the position of your story, begin from within your story, you will engender defensive reaction from your counterpart straight away. You have started by describing the problem, whatever it is, from your own perspective. You're beginning from the very place the other person considers as causing the problem between us in the first place. We're not really in a position to start the conversation from their story, as we do not fully understand or know that story. So the solution is to start difficult conversations from within the third story, that of an invisible third party observing. The third party story is not trying to establish who is right and who is wrong, just establish what the differences are. So what I'm saying here is, if you start a difficult conversation by focusing on what the differences are between the parties, you're more likely to make some progress, because you won't engender that defensive behaviour on both parties. And this is really important if you're actually the mediator, because if you start the mediator from one story or the other, they immediately think, oh well, he's biased, I'm wasting my time here. So this is where inquiry and curiosity become significant, as you cannot establish differences without being curious. When stepping into the third story, you have to be able to identify difference, to be able to address it, and you have to do that by asking questions and avoiding assumptions. I love questions. I think the secret to all these types of conversations, the secret to your work that you're doing in the CAB, is just ask questions. Once the conversation has been opened, curiosity becomes the road to success. By using calibrated or open questions, you can remove aggression from a conversation by acknowledging the other side. And doing so allows you to introduce ideas and requests without sounding controlling and pushy. I will stress here, you've got to be careful with questions. You don't want to sound like you're interrogating a person. So I'm just saying ask questions, open-ended questions that will encourage a conversation to go forward. So an example is of an aggressive question is, you can't just ignore the input of the consultants. A calibrated question is, what did you see as an outcome when avoiding the input of the consultants? Okay? I'm still laying a bit of blame here, but I'm asking them, what did you see as the problem, the likely outcome? Now just to end, the magic question when faced with a difficult or impossible request is, how am I supposed to do that? How can I achieve that? This question is asking your counterpart to step in beside you and resolve your mutual problem. It is asking to collaborate on a solution. The how-to question, this is the question that hostage negotiators use when they're trying to diffuse a situation, de-escalate a situation, and try and get a person to move from their position of wanting to kill somebody. If you ask somebody how we can do that, you're moving away from blaming them and saying, well, how can we actually resolve this? If the solution they're asking for is, well, I want a helicopter to land there and lift me out. Well, yeah, fine. You don't say, no, that's impossible, because that's going to create a problem. You say, all right, well, how can we do that? Where's that helicopter going to come from? Where's it going to go to? You start getting into those sorts of details, then they might start to realise, well, that's not going to work. Okay. That's me.
Any questions?
Yes.
Oh, that was really good, Warren. I had read his PowerPoint notes before the meeting, and I knew it was going to be a lot of good and useful and wise teaching for us. I will send you all a copy of the PowerPoint so you can see in full the notes for what he said today, which is really important. And I don't know, for some reason, this has reminded me of Judi Dench in Best Marigold Hotel. And she was talking to a person on a hotline about her internet connection at her home, and the other person was clearly going through a script. And that's not what we want to do in these discussions. And when she went to India, she got a job in a call centre teaching them the English, more English. And she taught them how to listen and respond. It was really good. It's well worth going back and having another look at it. It's along these lines. And don't go into something with a script. Yes, we have our notes. Yes, we know what we've done all that prep that Warren told us to do. But don't have a script. You know, be open and listen and let it go. Let go of your idea that you've got an agenda and a script to go through. I think one thing I'm taking away from this is the BATNA.
Okay.
Something I had never thought of before, to have something in mind as a good alternative if you can't come to a resolution. And also the power of silence. That's a really good one. As a teacher, where I used the power of silence was when you asked a child a question but they needed a bit more time to formulate an answer. So from that angle, you were telling it to us as listeners, but it's also a good one when you question. Wait, give the person a chance to answer. And I sat in with a client last week in the CAB, and she was very distressed, and she rang Aviva while I was there with her. This is an organisation that helps people in a difficult situation when they need accommodation or help with domestic violence and so on. And she had the phone on speaker, and so I was party to the conversation. And the lady at the other end was very clearly going through a script, and this poor girl got so distressed she hung up. And she needed their help. So we need to be careful with that too. Don't just follow a script. Slow down, reword it. Take a breather and give the girl a chance to get her thoughts together. She was in no state to be able to cope with shotgun questions coming at her like that. And that, in the end, the conversation ended by the hanging up. And we were able to find another solution, by the way, but it was sad to see that happen. So what Warren has been teaching us today is extremely important for all of us and valuable information. So thanks so much, Warren, for coming and giving your time and sharing with us.
If I've got one message, I found these, with the work we were doing, that the last thing people needed, and they did need it, but the last thing they needed was actually problem solving. We, I think all of us in our roles have a tendency to want to jump to the problem solving bit. And sometimes even a community house, we would have people come in a highly agitated state. And people would start, the receptionists and that would start saying, well, okay, well, we can send you to this place, or we can do this. And the first thing they'd say is, oh, I've already done that. I've already seen him.
Yes.
They don't, the problem solving bit has to come at the end.
Yeah.
You have to work through the emotional bit. The best thing you could do was just go and listen to what those people had to say. You know, even if you didn't say anything, just listen to what they had to say, and you would see them de-escalate and get to a point where you could start talking about, actually, okay, well, maybe we could solve this problem. How about we try this? So if that's the takeaway I can give you guys.
Wonderful.
Okay.
Thanks, Warren. So as I said, I'll be sending you the PowerPoint slides so you have those notes. Thank you, Connor, for the live stream today. And that's really awesome. And it's going to be, the recording of the live stream will go on the Volunteering Mid and South Canterbury YouTube channel, so that you can go back over it if you need to, or other people can see it and benefit from it. You have this little paper on your chair there, that's the feedback form. You can't leave the building without filling this in. The door will automatically lock if you try to leave. Just leave it on the table. And we're going to have snacks over here, and I'll bring out the hot drink trolley over here, and there's cold water there. So stay and enjoy each other's company. And I'll just close the meeting. Ki runga, ki raro, ki roto, ki waho, re, ki ato te rangi marie. Thank you so much for coming.